to the History Rundown. My name is Janet Greenwater, and today we will be talking about Nativism and its major role throughout our nation's history. From colonial restrictions on teaching Catholicism in schools to Trump's anti-Mexican tweets in today's age, white supremacy and tight controls on immigration have been at the forefront of American politics. Today we will explore, in depth, the history of our nation's relationship with immigrants and how hate groups and hate speech have targeted these immigrants. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jebediah Short, an esteemed guest and educated professor at the University of North Seattle.
It's a pleasure to be here, Janet. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, according to your expertise, when would you say Nativism begins in our history?
Terrific question. The concept of Nativism started as Europeans came over to the U.S. The English thought of Native Americans as stupid, especially because of their different language and culture. Over the course of early American history, Native Americans were forced off of their land, divided from their culture, and dehumanized in American society. Their culture and lifestyle was seen as a threat by white settlers who sought to continue the trend of European culture in the colonies and later on America. This was a prominent part in America's ironic nativist history, treating actual Native people as outsiders and forcing white culture upon them. This prejudice at the beginning of the American history was beginning to shape American nativism and would contribute to the creation of the Know Nothing Party, the policies of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Immigration Act, the KKK, and the nativist sentiment in politics and media of today.
When did its earliest movement begin to evolve?
One of the first nativist movements we can see in American history is anti-Catholicism. Starting in colonial times, white Protestant Americans were not fans of the Catholics because they worried that Catholics had a stronger alliance to the Pope than to the American government. This belief led to a series of laws pushing for Catholicism in schools, such as the Massachusetts School Law of 1642. This law insisted that Protestant teachings be taught in schools and that people must at least once a week, quote, catch size in religion. Religion in schools led to Protestantism becoming dominant in American culture, and Catholics were then forced to start their own schools for their own children. This movement carried on in history, running through the 20th century. There was a multitude of newspapers and propaganda criticizing the religion and attacking its followers. One example is the paper The Menace, running with headlines like, and I quote, "Rome suppressing free speech by bloodshed," which demonized Catholics and alienated its followers from American society. In fact, throughout history, quote, "science has been used to justify racism and anti-Catholicism." The Irish and African Americans had their faces compared to white people's faces, and scientists attempted to make connections between non-white races and negative traits like being dumber or lazy. Madison Grant wrote the popular Passing of a Great Race, in which he wrote, quote, "If the melting pot is allowed to boil without control, and we continue to follow our national motto and deliberately blind ourselves to all distinctions of race, creed, or color, the type of Native American of colonial descent will become as extinct as the Athenian age," what's that word, Janet? Of Pericles, and the Vikings of Royal.
Wow, that's some pretty heavy stuff. How does nativism tie more into politics, though? Were there any, say, political parties that pushed a similar nativist agenda?
One of the first nativist groups or parties formed was the Know Nothing Party. It was formed in 1855 by Louis Charles Levin, and their model or goal was to block, quote, "impure foreigners," such as Jews and Catholics, and those of other descents and religions. The party was made up of Protestant white men who were mostly part of the middle class. These men feared Catholics in that they would come to the U.S. and reshape the government by wanting to institute the Pope as their leader. The party was based on a few ideals, but strong ones indeed. The platform, for example, called for one, repeal of all naturalization laws, another, none but Native Americans for office, a pure American common school system, and finally, American laws and amen. The party played a major role in colonial America, but gained more support during the 1840s, when many Irish and Germans started to come over. This happened as a result of the famine in Europe, creating internal push factors. The ideas of the Know Nothing Party spread quickly across the Northeast during this time. The party was initially supposed to be secret, and if asked about the party or their membership, they would respond, quote, "I know nothing," end quote. In 1 year, they went from 50,000 members to 1 million. As they started to gain more members, they started to have a real effect on policymaking. For example, a law established in California ruled that no Chinese person could testify in front of a judge at any time whatsoever. The party never used violence, but in one instance, the Know-Nothings rioted and 22 people were killed. Levi Boone, or as some people call him Levy, a know-nothing mayor of Chicago, barred all immigrants from having any sort of job in the city. Luckily, the Know-Nothing Party never gained a seat in the White House, and they weren't supported by everyone. Thank God. Most notable among their critics was Abe Lincoln, who wrote in a letter to a friend, quote, "I am not a know-nothing. That is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we begin by declaring that, quote, all men are created equal. We now practically read it, quote, all men are created equal except Negroes." Millard Fillmore, who affiliated with the Know-Nothing Party, did not win enough votes to become president, and eventually moved over to the Republican Party, where he brought a majority of the Know-Nothing Party along with him. This then led a decline in the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothing Party was one of the first grouping of nativists in our country's history.
Interesting. And what other ways did nativism influence politics? Maybe in the judiciary sector of the government?
Janet, that's another terrific question. But I got it. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was directed toward the Chinese people and put a halt on them coming in, and the Immigration Act of 1924 put a halt on most European immigrants to the U.S. Firstly, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, signed by Chester A. Arthur, prohibited, quote, until the expiration of 10 years next, after the passage of this act, the coming of Chinese laborers to the U.S. be, and the same as hereby, suspended, end quote. It was initiated because of the increase in competition for jobs and the poor economy post-Civil War. The act was only supposed to last 10 years, but was replaced by the Geary Act in 1902, which continued the exclusion. The act was finally repealed in 1943 by the Magnuson Act. During the years of the Chinese Exclusion Act, only 105 people a year were allowed into the states. Prior to the act, many Chinese had settled in San Francisco and the West because of the railroad and the gold rush. These Chinese people had to recertify and retain citizenship to stay or come back in. The U.S.'s Chinese Exclusion Act had a massive impact on surrounding countries, later leading to Canada creating their own Chinese Exclusion Act.
That's awful. What were other examples of nativism shown through these types of laws?
Well, the Immigration Act of 1924 also halted immigration and was signed under our buddy, Calvin Coolidge. The act was especially designed to stop Jews and Italians from coming into the country, as well as Africans, Asians, and Arabs. The purpose described in the transcript as to, quote, limit immigration of aliens into the U.S. During the time, the U.S. Department of the State Office of the Historian said the purpose was to, and I quote, preserve the ideal of American, what's that word, Janet? Homogeneity. A major push for the Immigration Act came from the Red Scare of 1921, which led to increased xenophobic fears amongst Americans. The U.S. set quotas on countries based off how many people from that country were already in the U.S. The new national quota was 2% of any nationality after the act was put into play. During the course of the act, the U.S. was much more willing to take in people over the age of 21 who were willing and able-bodied to work in agriculture. The reason for the Immigration Act was due to a fear from the Red Scare, and again, an increase in xenophobic fears. The act was repealed and replaced in 1965 during the Lyndon B. Johnson era with the Immigration and Nationality Act. This act opened the doors to all immigrants. It allowed as many as 170,000 people in, and a maximum of 20,000 from one country. Over time, the immigration quotas would go away, and the U.S. would become more friendly towards immigrants. Not until the 1990s was the U.S. most willing to bring people in.
Fascinating comparison, Dr. Short. As we've seen so far, nativism has played a large role not only in our nation's politics, but also in the legal fabric of our government. After our short intermission, Dr. Short will be sharing more information regarding the social aspects of nativism. Thank you, and please keep watching. And we're back for more History Rundown. Jebediah, what would you say is one of the most significant social movements regarding nativism?
Definitely racial hate movements. The KKK was formed in the late 1800s in the Deep South during the Reconstruction era by Nathan Forrest. The Ku Klux Klan had a different mission than the Know-Nothings. They wanted to purify the country, angered after African Americans had been freed from slavery and given the same rights as all men. They believed that, and let me quote, "We do not hate any group of people. However, we do hate some things that certain groups are doing to our race and our nation. We hate drugs, homosexuality, abortion, race mixing, because these things go against God's law, and they are destroying all white nations." The KKK has arisen 3 different times throughout the course of our history. The first time was during the Reconstruction era, when the KKK went on violent night rides. They killed and raped many African Americans. The second time they arose was during the 1920s, where many immigrants were coming to the U.S. 4 million KKK members marched on Washington to show off their anti-immigrant sentiment. The third time was during the 1960s, when they worked with George Wallace in Alabama and the police to attack the civil rights movement. They especially attacked African Americans and other religious groups. They were based off of white supremacy, anti-immigrant, neo-Nazi, and neo-Confederate sentiment. The KKK was also the most physically abusive of any of these nativist groups. They would publicly show hate towards minorities, especially black people, through public lynching or through intimidating, threatening messages, putting on ropes to scare their victims and hide their identities. Even today, we still see a small group of about 6,000 Klan members left.
And how do we see a similar nativist sentiment in our world now?
We see a lot of nativist sentiment put into today's policy making, as Donald Trump and his cabinet have demonstrated through the enactment of the travel ban, which halted immigration primarily from 7 majority Muslim countries. Not only has Donald Trump put these laws into action, or attempted to, but he has also said many terrible things about people from different ethnic groups. For example, when Trump said, I think Islam hates us, there's something there. There's a tremendous hatred. He was directly making nativist connections and trying to incite fear into the minds of Americans and imply that all Muslims had the intent to damage and destroy American values. Trump's words have incited much more violence and hatred toward minority groups. Hate crimes are committed based off of race and religion, and a recent report from the Southern Poverty Law Center shows that there are around 1,600 anti-immigrant, neo-Nazi, black separatist, neo-Confederate, racist skinhead, and other groups. Trump's slogan stating, "Make America Great Again," is meant to have a reassertion of American identity. Many people who stand behind Trump believe that immigrants steal American jobs and do not belong here. Trump himself has publicly said in his presidential campaign announcement speech, quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists."
Obviously, this isn't true. But coming from someone who is now our president, these words have power to provoke fear in our people. These presumptions inspire horrible outlooks, such as this one from a blog post. Quote, "The man, who looked to be in his late 40s, but could have been 50 or 95, for all I could tell, or care, had been living here in the U.S. for over a decade. Over a decade! And the son of a bitch still couldn't or wouldn't learn or speak even the simplest of sentences? Get the F-bomb out of my country, asshole. I'm sick to death of, quote, permanent immigrants who take all we have to suffer in the U.S., but have no intention of becoming citizens. Get the hell out of here," end quote.